Okay, let's dive right into this. Have you ever had that lingering feeling like no matter how much our society seems to progress, there's just something fundamental holding us back? Well, today we're unpacking an incredibly explosive premise from a deeply analytical text. It argues that modern society is actually masking a completely new form of slavery. And we're not talking about the historical chains of the past here. We're talking about an invisible matrix of control that operates right under our noses every single day. It's a truly fascinating, eye-opening look at how systems of power actually function today. So I want you to ask yourself, has the era of slaves truly ended? We usually just assume that because physical emancipation happened, human subjugation simply vanished. Poof, gone. But what if it didn't disappear at all? What if it just evolved? What if the chains went from being made of heavy iron to being completely invisible?
To really get this, we need a massive paradigm shift. The source text introduces this concept of modern enslavement, known as istibad in Arabic. Unlike historical slavery, this systemic architecture doesn't need to legally own your neck. No one holds a deed to your body anymore. Instead, it operates by controlling the very things you rely on to exist. We're talking about your survival, your honor, and most crucially, your thought. It's essentially a system that completely dictates how you live, without you ever having to see the walls of your cell.
Now, before we get into the exact mechanisms of this control, I really need to state a crucial caveat. The things we're about to discuss, stuff like religion, education, politics, the media, they are absolutely not inherently evil. They are completely neutral tools. They can be tools of building that genuinely elevate humanity, or they can be twisted into tools of enslavement. It depends entirely on who's holding the reins and what their ultimate goal happens to be. Let's move through the agenda and map out the 6 distinct pillars that construct this invisible matrix. We've got exploited religion, flawed education, oppressive politics, a usury economy, enslaving media, and finally, blind partisanship. Let's start unpacking them. We're going to start our journey by looking inward. The very first layer of this matrix targets the most private, delicate parts of our existence, our mind and our soul. Because think about it, if you can capture those, the physical body will gladly just follow along. All right, Section 1, exploited religion and flawed education. The source text makes a profoundly interesting point here. The absolute most effective way to subjugate a massive population isn't actually through brute force. It's to condition people to accept their chains willingly, ideally starting right from childhood, simply by manipulating what they believe and how they learn. This brings us straight to the exploitation of religion. Pure divine messages were originally meant to liberate humans, right? To stop them from submitting to other humans. But this gets twisted in 3 major ways. First, you have intentional forgery, where sacred texts are manipulated for financial or worldly gain. Second, elevating human clerics or leaders to an unquestionable, almost divine-like status, where their word suddenly supersedes any critical thought. And third, abandoning traditional faith altogether, to basically create new modern religions that worship base human desires. In all 3 of these cases, the ultimate tool of liberation is completely flipped into a tool of submission. Then, we have the educational and parenting side of things. The text draws this brilliant contrast between 2 extremes that, surprisingly, lead to the exact same result, enslavement. On one hand, you have an education of extreme deprivation. These are overly strict, oppressive environments that essentially break a child's spirit, creating a subservient adult who's too afraid to challenge authority. But on the exact opposite end, you have extreme excess. Spoiling kids and giving them absolutely everything they demand doesn't make them free. Ironically, it just makes them permanent slaves to their own endless, insatiable desires. It's an exhausting way to live, and neither extreme creates a truly free, independent thinker. Okay, let's zoom out a bit. We're moving from the inner world of the mind to look at the external, physical systems that govern our society at large. This is the next room of our matrix. We're looking at the architecture of survival, the systems that literally dictate whether we eat or whether we starve. Moving to Section 2, oppressive politics and usury economics. The crucial point here is seeing how state power and global financial systems are incredibly intricately woven together. They work in tandem to lock people, and even entire countries, into a state of permanent dependency. Let's look at the political side first. The source text has a very clear, completely impartial view on this. It literally does not matter if a government is left-wing or right-wing. Any ruler or political system that operates without true accountability essentially functions as an organized mafia, period. When power goes totally unchecked, citizens are downgraded to mere subjects. To get their basic needs met, like security, food, shelter, they basically have to trade their obedience and their silence. It's a highly transactional, cold form of subjugation. Now, to really grasp the economic trap, consider this powerful quote from Edward Raymond that's cited in the text, talking about those who control global finance. They distribute the blood necessary for the vitality of the economic system. If they wish, they deny it, so it cannot breathe. The text heavily highlights how a usury-based economy, or riba, driven by interest and endless debt, creates an absolutely inescapable cycle. It forces individuals into a lifetime of paying off loans, and it traps developing nations into total subservience to wealthier global powers. It's a financial leash, plain and simple.
So you might be wondering at this point, if we're so trapped by our own minds, our governments, and our economies, why on earth aren't people uniting to break out? Well, that leads us directly to the final two pillars. These are the specific tools used to blind us to the very chains we're wearing.
That brings us to Section 3, enslaving media and blind partisanship. These are the great distractors. They exist to ensure that the subjugated masses remain fragmented, distracted, and endlessly fighting each other, rather than looking up and dismantling the unjust systems above them.
What's really fascinating here is how the source frames modern media. We usually just think of it as entertainment or news, right? But the source describes it more like a giant adult pacifier. It actively turns truth to falsehood. It normalizes constantly running away from our real-world problems. It stimulates desires nonstop through advertising and imagery, without ever actually providing any true fulfillment. And honestly, most dangerously, the sheer volume and speed of modern media completely cancels our ability to engage in critical, independent thinking. It essentially numbs us into accepting our reality.
And then, when we do finally engage with other people, we step right into the trap of blind partisanship. Look, it's entirely natural for humans to form groups and communities. We're social creatures. But this pillar corrupts that natural instinct into what the text calls a tribal cage. Suddenly, your loyalty to a political party, a specific leader, or a social faction becomes way more important than objective truth and justice. People end up aggressively defending the very systems that enslave them simply because, well, it's their team. We're nearing the climax of this explainer now. Because think about it. What happens when you take all of these isolated tools, the education, the finance, the politics, the media, and you wield them all at once on a massive global stage? You get this, the compounding control matrix. When you combine global lobbying groups, massive transnational monopolies, and huge media conglomerates, they do not operate in silos. They synergize. The financial sector funds the political lobbies. The politicians then write the laws that favor the monopolies. And the media conglomerates are right there to justify it all to the public. It creates an almost inescapable compounding web of control on a completely massive global scale. But hey, the text absolutely does not leave us hanging in despair. It actually offers a really empowering, optimistic resolution. True freedom begins the exact moment you become aware of this matrix. It starts by breaking those psychological chains first. It requires a conscious, daily refusal to submit your will, your honor, and your thought to human-made masters and corrupted systems. The ultimate goal here is to aim for a higher, universal liberation where you completely reclaim your independent mind. Which leaves us with the ultimate question. We've mapped out all 6 pillars. We've seen exactly how they subtly control our survival, our honor, and our thought. If the chains of modern enslavement are indeed completely invisible, how will you begin to break free today? Thank you so much for exploring this deeply profound source material with me in this explainer, and I really challenge you to look at the world just a little bit differently tomorrow.